Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee are planning to refocus their investigations of the White House on the 2016 scheme to silence two women alleging affairs with the president. The Washington Post was first to report that the committee, quote, is preparing to hold hearings and call witnesses involved in hush money payments to ex-Playboy model Karen McDougal and adult film star Stormy Daniels as soon as October. Those payments were coordinated by former Trump lawyer Michael Cohen, who's currently serving 3 years in prison for breaking campaign finance laws, among other accusations. Prosecutors in Cohen's case detailed the president's alleged role in the scheme, but closed their investigation last month with no additional charges. Now, according to the Post, quote, the new congressional inquiry will reopen questions about the extent of Trump's involvement in the episode and whether he would have been charged if not for Justice Department opinions that a sitting president cannot be indicted. The new line of inquiry will no doubt fuel more debate about impeachment, a move that's now favored by 134 Democrats in the House. Joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon of Pennsylvania, Vice Chair of the House Judiciary Committee. Congresswoman, thank you for joining us. Let me ask you this. This was investigated in the Southern District of New York. The case was closed without any further action. What can you learn here? What do you hope to learn here that we don't already know?
Well, what we know already is that Michael Cohen is serving jail time for campaign finance violations involving paying money in violation of campaign finance laws to affect the election of his then boss, Donald Trump. We know that the Southern District investigated it. We know that the DA in Manhattan is still investigating it, and just recently, just at the beginning of August, issued some more subpoenas. So there are active facts there that should be looked into. I think it would be malpractice of the judiciary not to look into whether or not the president authorized payments to anybody to try to impact his election.
I guess that's my question, because I've seen some of your colleagues. One of your colleagues I saw quoted said, your colleague said, already satisfied that the evidence is there that shows the president was a co-conspirator. Is that your view or not?
Well, there may be evidence there, but our committee hasn't seen it. Congress hasn't seen it. There was evidence presented to a grand jury. We know that the Southern District, the U.S. attorney up there, refers to someone who can only be the president as individual number one, as having authorized payments in violation of campaign finance laws. So, it's kind of like you can charge someone based upon what you've been told, but you need to see the evidence before you go to trial.
Who do you want to hear from?
I think we're going to have to follow the money, as they say, and see what is in the files from the Southern District. There were a lot of people involved. I'm much more interested in who authorized any hush money payments than I am in who they were given to.
The chairman of your committee, Jerry Nadler, says the Judiciary Committee is already engaged in an impeachment inquiry. Is this part of that?
I think it absolutely is. I mean, one of the core functions of the Judiciary Committee is to determine whether or not there are impeachable offenses. The Mueller report was part of that, but there are certainly a number of other allegations concerning this administration that could amount to high crimes and misdemeanors.
So I guess that's an interesting question, then. Do you believe the question you're posing here is whether the president was involved in or whether, in fact, he was the principal figure in setting up this scheme to go around campaign finance laws to keep the politically embarrassing affair a secret during the campaign? You believe if that's established, that would be impeachable, that would be a high crime?
Absolutely. In fact, the framers of the Constitution, when they debated those terms, whether or not there should be an impeachment clause, right here in Philadelphia where I'm sitting, they laid out a number of things that they viewed as impeachable offenses. And one of them was procuring election by corruption. If the president procured his election by corruption, then the founders of our country viewed that as an impeachable offense.
I guess the parallel, if it does come to this, if you have these hearings, if it's part of an impeachment inquiry, if this leads to an impeachment recommendation from your committee, I think one of the criticisms that might be leveled against taking that action would be, what about Bill Clinton? What about Democrats like Jerry Nadler, who chairs your committee in 1998, and how they handled Bill Clinton? Committed a felony, perjury, to cover up a politically embarrassing affair to keep the country from knowing about that. The position of Jerry Nadler, the position of just about every Democrat back then was, yeah, it was a felony. Yeah, it was to cover up something politically embarrassing, maybe something politically damaging, but it wasn't impeachable because it was a private matter.
Okay, well, so impeachment has always been a combination of actual conduct and a political calculation. At the end of the day, the question is whether the American people believe that it's an impeachable offense, and it's our job on judiciary to get the evidence out there.
I guess the question I'm asking, though, is the line that was drawn in 1998 was, yes, he might have committed a felony, but because it was about something that was ultimately private, a consensual affair, it wasn't impeachable. Now there'd be a charge, potentially, a charge that the president committed a felony to cover up a politically embarrassing affair, but it would be impeachable, even though it was a private consensual affair.
Well, I think there's a lot of distinctions there, the first of which being I wasn't in Congress back then. But I think the really important one is that the felony at issue here would be whether or not the president acted in a way that was corrupt to procure his own election. It really goes to the heart of our democratic system.
Say you're in an impeachment inquiry right now. Jerry Nadler said he anticipates votes by the end of the year. Is that still the plan? Do you think there will be votes from the House Judiciary Committee on specific articles of impeachment by the end of this calendar year?
I think that's what we're moving towards. I think we're trying to do an investigation into the various allegations of potentially impeachable conduct. And I would think that the president would support putting forward evidence that could clear him or not. All
right, Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon, Democrat from Pennsylvania. Thanks for taking a few minutes.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.